I'm talking about here is really something that is based on 15 years of editing this international yearbook of futurism studies, and I can pass it around for you to have a look at it. In those 15 years, more than 250 essays were published on various forms of futurism in the international sphere, which adds up to something like 7,500 pages. And I must say, what I'm talking about here today is very much based on the work of all these colleagues who have contributed to these publications. And when I was asked, to speak about, these international cross-fertilizations of futurism, I first had to think, which countries or which continents should I contemplate? And of course, I could have spoken about China, about Korea, about Japan, but as we are gathering here in Georgia, I thought I might introduce some aspects of futurism in Eastern Europe. And before I focus on some individual countries, and then afterwards discuss some of the general aspects of these cross-fertilizations, I would like to start my paper which actually talking about how futurism, which as you will all know originates in Italy, actually became an international phenomenon. Because there are other art movements that pretty much stayed put where they originated and had next to no repercussions in other countries. But this certainly was not the case with futurism, because between around 1890 and 1930, there was a plethora of groups, schools, and movements who propagated their artistic doctrines by means of short theoretical statements that were printed in journals or newspapers, on broadsheets or on pamphlets. And this manifesto mania really resulted from a desire not only to be new, modern and innovative, but also to establish clear boundaries and distinctions from what had gone on before and what coexisted in the contemporary field. So as a consequence, I think teachers of art history or modernist literature find themselves permanently confronted with students asking for some simple guides through this jungle of isms. And in fact, the book market has become kind of saturated with guides that show how the various avant-garde movements can be differentiated from each other. Now, I myself, in my teaching, I have always sought to counterbalance this tendency and to show my students the interconnections between these different avant-gardes. And this is particularly important for futurism because it had so many offshoots that cross-fertilized with coeval art movements and had an impact on these other movements who happened to exist at the same time. But I want to start with actually saying that the term futurism was not, like many people think, invented by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti and was not protected by anything like what we would call a copyright. The first to use the tag was the Catalan critic Gabriel Alomar in a speech of 1904, which was published as a book in 1905. And Alomar's El Futurisme was both an aesthetic manifesto and a political program that outlined how a secularized Spain, where it should be heading as a country. And Catalan intellectuals who heard this speech then merged Alomar's ideas with a movement that in Catalan history is known as modernisme. And modernism is not quite the same as what we call modernism nowadays. It's really something quite specifically Catalan. But this resulted in several newspapers and magazines that were carrying mastheads that were called something like Avenir, which is another word for future, or simply Futurisme. And Alomar's ideas circulated widely in France, and most critics nowadays agree that Marinetti must have known Alomar's speech because it was reprinted and it was printed in French and was easily available in the Mercure de France and various other journals. And Marinetti, being present in France every second or third month, must have known it. However, at the same time, I think there can be no doubt that the differences between the two programs rules out any possible indebtedness of Marinetti to Alomar. Nonetheless, we have to say that between 1909 and 1925, Marinetti's term futurism became a catchphrase for a process of innovation and cultural renewal that could be felt throughout Europe and also in other parts of the world. Although originating in Italy and proclaimed to the wider world in France, and you probably all have seen this version in the Figaro, the movement's ethos and rebellious drive could be found in many other countries. The Futurist Foundation Manifesto, this one here, was widely distributed, again on fly sheets or in magazines or newspapers, first obviously in Italy, and soon after in many other European countries. And I give you, I think, 3 examples here of the Foundation manifestos in French, in German, and also in English. And within months, it also reached Asia and the Americas. The author received so many reports from the national and foreign press that he intended to publish a 2-volume documentation of the international reaction that was given to his newly found movement. And the stream of manifestos that Marinetti published in the early 1910s, I must emphasize this, was not only geared towards an Italian public, but also addressed to audiences in other countries. For example, on the 2nd of April 1910, just about a year after the Foundation Manifesto, he gave a lecture at the Lyceum Club in London and published it as the Futurist Address to the English. Here, the French version of it, because I also need to say that many of these manifestos were written either in Italian or in French, but often translated into other languages. And even if they were Italian, Marinetti regularly at the same time published a French version of it, because France was more widely spoken in Europe. So this was then followed, as you can see here, in June 1910 by a proclamation to the Spaniards. But Marinetti knew damn well that the European hub for any artistic development in the modern world was undoubtedly Paris, and thus his prime focus was always directed towards France. And Marinetti, I need to emphasize this, was very well prepared for launching Futurism's international career in France, as he had gone to a French school. He had received a thoroughly French-oriented education, and after his studies, he commuted regularly between France and Italy, and he ran the Milanese office of a very important magazine called L'Anthologie Revue, and he collaborated with various literary journals in France. His early poems and plays were all written in French, and show an intimate familiarity with these latest artistic trends, that were discussed in Paris at the time. And he had a friend called Félix Fénéon, who served as director of contemporary art at the Galerie Bernheim Jeune, and he was very sympathetic to Marinetti's iconoclastic program. So in 1912, he agreed to exhibit some 27 futurist paintings in a show that turned out to be a major success, garnering reviews all over Europe. And this exhibition became the first leg of an international tour, which in combination with other paintings then traveled throughout Europe. And I've shown here on the map all the cities where it was shown. So the next one was London, then it went to Berlin, Brussels, Hamburg, north to Copenhagen, back south to The Hague in Amsterdam, then further down the Rhine to Cologne, then Munich, Vienna, Budapest, Karlsruhe, Lviv, Dresden, Prague, Leipzig, Halle, and Hanover. Not bad doing, for a show of futurist paintings. So we can see that already in 1912, 1913, futurism was not just an Italian affair, but an international phenomenon. And let me use two countries in Eastern Europe to show what this means in concrete terms. And I first take you to Poland. News of Marinetti's movement reached Poland in October 1909, when Ignacy Grabowski published a translation of the Foundation and Manifesto of Futurism that had appeared in the Figaro. And the Polish public had a chance to see futurist works of art when the European travel exhibition that I mentioned here moved from Paris to Berlin, and Herbert Walden supplemented the show in his Sturmgalerie with works of various expressionists and sent it to Lviv, or Lwów as it was called in Polish. And futurist theater activities became known when Maria Sławinska described the Grande Serata Futurista at the Teatro Verdi on 12th of December 1913. And two young artists from Krakow, Bruno Jarzynski and Stanisław Młodzieniec, who had studied in Russia, opened with Titus Krzyżewski a futurist club where they organized poetry concerts along the lines of the Stray Dog Cabaret that you might be familiar with in St. Petersburg, or the Italian Serate. And these activities led in 1921 to the formation of the first futurist group in Poland. And that is their first proclamation. A kind of, yeah, what do you want to call it? It's a broadsheet, because it really is. It's huge. And contains various manifestos that these three guys had written in the previous year. Many of the works produced by these futurists in Poland carried features that were reminiscent of Expressionism and actually a gamut of other modernist movements. And the same merger of styles can be found in Polish Formism, which was another art movement that fused elements from Futurism, Cubism, and Expressionism. And what characterized them all was that they rarely adopted the name Futurism. So here they call it Formism because they had a focus on form, and they called, you know, their magazine Formici. Yes, I mentioned these two guys who had been in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And from there, they also brought to Poland, you know, the first stirrings of futurism in Russia, and the various futurist movements like egofuturism, Rayism, and Imaginism, which then was introduced, you know, to Poland and merged with the ideas that they had received from Italy, so that Polish futurism that, you know, came into existence in the early 20s, one can really say it was very different from Italian futurism. And it is therefore understandable that in their second leaflet, that's this one here, they proclaimed, I quote, "We clasp the hands of France and Switzerland. Marinetti is foreign to us." So Polish futurism was a highly multifaceted phenomenon that received its inspiration both from Italian and Russian futurism and various other avant-garde movements. So when these stimuli then merged with indigenous traditions, like symbolism, romanticism, and even folklore, and then after 1924 with the international constructivist movement, one can say that futurist ideas underwent a process of permutation, and the resulting works possessed an intriguingly original character. And I'll just give you three examples here by Titus Krzyżewski. Let me now move over to neighboring Czechoslovakia. And in fact, as we have some colleagues from Czechoslovakia here, they might have a few things to add, you know, after my paper. In Czechoslovakia, the press responded to futurism predominantly in a very sensationalist manner. Commentators distorted the futurist program and turned the word futurism into a synonym for something considered absurd, bizarre, or just, you know, entertaining. Selective readings of Marinetti's works randomly picked sentences and distorting citations reduced futurism to a silly play with letters and fonts, and presented Marinetti as a person basically seeking notoriety and being primarily interested in scandal mongering. And as a consequence, Czechoslovakia never saw the formation of a futurist group. However, there was a native movement called Civilism, situated somewhere between futurism, cubism, and surrealism, which sought to depict the technical and industrial achievements of the modern age, as well as the new lifestyles that had shaped the industrial civilization. And its key representative, Stanislav Kostka-Neumann, borrowed extensively from Marinetti's programmatic writings and tried to adapt futurism to the Czech cultural realities. However, there was a problem, and that was that the Czechs had only recently gained independence, and cultural institutions were only in the process of being formed. So futurism's iconoclastic program could hardly find a following in a country that did not have any illustrious past to be destroyed. And this situation became even more complicated after the First World War, when Marinetti gave his first performance in Prague in December 1921 and organized a staging of his mini-dramas, those syntheses as they were called, at the Schwander Theatre. Many newspapers quoted Marinetti's enthusiastic proclamation, "Vive la Prague futuriste!" And they judged, I quote, "Marinetti came, he was heard, and he conquered." The Czech intellectuals admired, I quote, "this Italian modernist for his radical style, lively anti-traditionalism, and fusion of art and life as a definite means of overcoming decadent artistry." End of quote. However, this enthusiasm vanished when Marinetti's endorsement of the new fascist government became public. Now, Marinetti was suddenly declared a figure of the second and third order, and instead Mayakovsky's futurism was proclaimed to be an authentic expression of the age of modernity. Also, the Devětsil group officially rejected Italian futurism and adopted many of the slogans and stylistic devices of Russian futurism. Yet, they still published a special issue on Marinetti and futurism in February 1929. And I would say that a latent layer of the Italian movement was carried like a palimpsest into their own left-wing program. In fact, I would say that the Devětsil group demonstrates that futurism in Eastern Europe was anything but a satellite of Marinetti's movement. The artists and writers had their own notions of what constituted futurism, and they borrowed from the Italians only that fitted into their own local agenda. And as they did not want to be identified with Marinetti's ideology, very generally often described as, well, he is a kind of fascist writer, they avoided the label futurism altogether. And one can say probably that the most creative futurists were those who declared futurism to be dead and buried and created something new of their own bat, but really it was futurism under a new guise, interacting with new historical, social, and political realities. And something similar, I think, can also be observed in the Caucasus. In Georgia, futurism was intimately interwoven, as we've heard many times today, with the brothers Ilya and Kirill Zdanevich. Their father was Polish, and he worked as a French teacher, which meant that his sons learned to speak French from a very early age. In 1911, the family friend Boris Lopatinsky returned from Paris with a copy of Marinetti's Foundation and Manifesto of Futurism, probably in the anthology Le Futurisme, which also contained other futurist manifestos. And they become quite important because a few years later, when Zdanevich moved to Russia, he recited and presented in various soirees other futurist manifestos which he must have known from the French source, and this anthology, Le Futurisme, is therefore the most probable source, for his activities. When he was in St. Petersburg to study law, he became friends with several local futurists, and he translated even some of Marinetti's French language manifestos, and as I said, began to propagate them in public meetings. However, it needs to be said that Zdanevich was not at all a blind follower of Marinetti's theories. Although he experimented with Marinetti's poetic devices and wrote his first poems in parole in libertà style, he very soon switched over to Zamu, the alogical language developed by Vladimir Khletnikov and Alexei Khrushchev. He also rejected Marinetti's demands to destroy the culture of the past, and instead adopted a doctrine of what he called everythingism. And that is something where the arts of all times, all regions, and all schools were to be synthesized into a new whole. And this concept, in fact, had been developed by his friend Mikhail Vidantyev, who was the leader of a futurist group in Russia called Bloodless Murder. And this group published a magazine called Veskrovye Ubийство, and Zdanevich agreed to edit a special issue focused on Albania. And that is the beginning of Zdanevich as a futurist poet, poet, but I can also say dramatist, although these dramas, they are very different from dramas that you might have read. But anyway, the first that he produced was called Yanko, King of Albania, and was definitely based on that special issue that he edited. Now also his brother Kirill spent 2 years, from 1911 to 13, in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and 6 months during 1913 in Paris. So when he returned to Tbilisi, he also knew a great deal about futurism and adopted it in many of his graphic works and paintings, and I'll just show you 3 examples. Then Ilya emigrated to Paris in 1921 and continued his avant-garde activities on behalf of the group 41 Degrees that we heard about earlier on, the group that had formed, a futurist group that had formed here in Tbilisi. But it now was operating as the Parisian branch of the Levie Front Iskусства, the left front of the arts, i.e. a Russian futurist group. And then in the 1920s, this short-lived futurist group, H2SO4, was active in Tbilisi and edited this volume that we have passed around earlier on. Now, H2SO4, as you know, is sulfuric acid, also known as vitriol, and this highly corrosive propensities made it a suitable metaphor for the futurist desire to destroy ancient or old-fashioned art. And it's 100 pages. They presented an innovative fusion of words and images, and as you all have seen in the course of today, had an absolutely amazing, dazzling visual quality that mixed futurist with Dada elements. Two movements clearly that were cross-fertilizing each other in Georgia. So Georgian futurism really was a cross-cultural phenomenon that combined Italian and Russian futurism with the latest European avant-garde tendencies. And by orientating Georgian art towards the cultural centers of Western Europe, the Georgian futurists could counteract the colonial influence of Russia, from which the country had suffered for more than 100 years. And by adopting Italy and France, rather than Moscow or St. Petersburg as their cultural reference points, the futurists in Georgia were expressing their opposition to the cultural hegemony of Russia. And thus they made a vital contribution to the creation of a free and liberal atmosphere in Tbilisi and to the integration of Georgia into the global cultural processes of the 20th century. And in this respect, futurism contributed to a cultural renaissance that was much more than just an artistic style. In the neighboring nation of Armenia, futurism also entered relatively quickly, first through the diaspora groups in the Ottoman Empire, and then via Russia and Georgia. Constantinople and Tbilisi were two cultural centers with a large Armenian population in the early 20th century. And in what is present-day Istanbul, Marinetti's manifestos and poems found an immediate translator in Hrant Nazarians, a young symbolist poet who published in 1910 a brochure called F.D. Marinetti and Futurism. But it needs to be said that Nazarian's efforts to introduce futurism in the Ottoman and Caucasian region did not find much response. Much more successful was Karadarwish, pseudonym of Hagop Genjan, who lived in Tbilisi at the time and was very well informed about Marinetti and Russian futurism. So in 1914, Karadarwish published a book called Ince Futurismi, What is Futurism?, which offered an almost systematic introduction to Italian futurism, far more comprehensive than the brochure that Nazarians had published in Istanbul. But where and how Kara informed himself about Marinetti is still rather unclear. His information certainly exceeded the journalistic treatment that futurism had received in the Armenian and Georgian press. But what exactly he read and how he got hold of futurist programs is still not really known. But anyway, we know that the year 1914 was really a turning point in his career. On 20th of January, following the acquaintance he made with the Russian futurists David Bolyuk, Vasily Kaminsky, and Vladimir Mayakovsky, he gave a first public lecture on futurism at the Artistic Society Theatre in Tbilisi. And his theoretical activities was accompanied by a poetic production in what I would call a truly futurist style. His quasi-phonetic Cubo-futurist poems were published in books and magazines and also featured in the Sofia Melnikova miscellany that you've seen early on, that was published in 1919. And here you see 3 poems from that miscellany. In 1915, Kara gave himself the title Hai Guzan Futurist, Armenian Futurist Bard. And he performed a series of poetry evenings while touring the Caucasus. It was for one of those occasions that he wrote a proclamation entitled Orient as a Source of Art and New Creation, where for the first time the theme of an Oriental futurism emerged. Here, futurism was dressed in the new colors of the East. For Karadarwish, it was no longer necessary to go to Europe to instigate a renewal of the arts and literature. The indigenous traditions of the Orient, such as folk art, operetta, and local poetry, were also used as a source of inspiration for this Oriental futurism. Now, after this whistle-stop tour from Paris to Krakow, from Prague to Istanbul, and then finally to Tbilisi, let me focus your attention on Russia, where the most important futurist group outside Italy emerged in the 1910s. And as you probably all know, in 1914, Marinetti visited Moscow and St. Petersburg. Here you see a poster and a photograph of one of his lectures. His intention was to establish contacts with Russians who were also called futurists. But then the Russians rebelled against his claim of being the leader of a worldwide futurist movement and made it clear to him that they were an independent artistic movement that would not follow any orders issued by the Milanese headquarters. During these lectures that Marinetti gave in Moscow and St. Petersburg, Khletnikov and Lifshitz distributed a leaflet in which they declared that they were not willing, and I quote now, to place the noble neck of Asia under the yoke of Europe. So on 11th of February, 2 days later, Khletnikov and Lifshitz repeated their declaration of independence from futurism in Western Europe at a public meeting in St. Petersburg advertised as our response to Marinetti. A public discussion between Marinetti and representatives of Russian futurism took place on 13th of February, in which Ilyas tried to bridge the gap between the Italian poet on the one side and Mayakovsky and Bolyuk on the other. But in the end, Marinetti failed to establish any collaboration between the two branches of futurism. And judging by subsequent statements, there were also serious disagreements in aesthetic matters. Marinetti said that most of what he had seen in Russia was not true futurism, but primitivism or aesthetic atavism. And vice versa, Benedict Lifshitz declared that the Russian futurists, I quote, had outstripped their Italian comrades in quite a few things, and that most of the ideas advanced by the Italian futurists were for them either old-hat or half-baked solutions to the artistic problems of our time. End of quotation. So the reactions that Marinetti received during his trip to Russia in 1914 show that although futurism had become an umbrella term for a radical reform of artistic practices, it could in fact denote quite disparate phenomena. A great many artists in Russia, Europe, and in fact in the world at large embraced aspects of Italian futurism, but the label futurism denoted artistic developments that were anything but uniform and homogeneous. We can say, however, that even before the First World War, futurism definitely had become an umbrella term for a European and then a worldwide phenomenon. A broad spectrum of this international futurism, and this includes many epi-futurist or para-futurist variants, you can find described and analyzed in a handbook that I edited some 5 years ago. It's a very thick 1,000-page volume with many individual entries on futurism in various parts of the world. So, as I will try and show in the final part of my paper, it was substantially different in Italy or in Russia from what emerged in the 1920s under the umbrella term Futurismo Mondiale. And I use the term Futurismo Mondiale because that is a new tag. In my analysis, I speak about international futurism, which is a relatively neutral term, but Futurismo Mondiale is a term that Marinetti used and turns up in so many writings of the 1920s. And I want to make clear that what Marinetti devised as Futurismo Mondiale is not the same as what we have analyzed here as international futurism. And this Futurismo Mondiale was again revealed by Marinetti where else but Paris, like the first futurist movement. The second futurist movement, the Futurismo Mondiale, also starts in Paris in 1924. Here you can see the manifesto, Le Futurisme Mondial. Now let me explain a little bit a background of this manifesto. In the course of the First World War, futurism largely vanished from the public mind, but then resurfaced again in the early 1920s with a new membership, a new direction, and a new program. And this is usually referred to as Secondo Futurismo. Because against all expectation, futurism rose like a phoenix from the ashes and soon counted more than 1,000 members organized in dozens of branches sprinkled all across the Italian peninsula. And Marinetti tried to obtain recognition of his new troops from the new government. But it needs to be said that he failed to have futurism established as the official art of the state. Because in the first years of the fascist regime, most of what was created in Italy was characterized by a return to order in artistic matters. Futurism could sometimes play a useful role in propagating the government's modernist image, but it was never allowed to play more than a minor position in the cultural hierarchy. And it was therefore important that futurist propaganda countered this negative attitude that was displayed by the fascist functionaries, and that it offered the Italian public and the cultural establishment convincing evidence that futurism was the only Italian art of global significance. And that is where this concept of futurismo mondiale comes in. Because Marinetti observed with great interest how critics and artists responded to the ideas that were emanating from Italy, and he devised a diagram, and I'll show you the manuscript here, that presented futurism as the fount and origin of the historical avant-garde. And this served as the basis for his Le Futurisme Mondial manifesto, in which Marinetti co-opted a large number of artists under the rubric futurists without knowing or futurists of conviction. So in Italy, as in many other countries, futurist ideas, as I said, merged with doctrines taken from a variety of other modernist movements. Dynamic cross-currents flowed between various isms and gave rise to what in chemistry is known as elective affinities. So in these aesthetic test tubes bubbled a seething mixture of ingredients: symbolism, cubism, futurism, expressionism, Dadaism, constructivism, surrealism, you name it. And when these came into contact with a given artist's personal predispositions, they interacted in a quite unpredictable manner and produced a very diverse and highly original range of works of art. And consequently, in the course of the 35 years of the existence of the futurist movement, futurism developed many forms and facets in dozens of countries and artistic disciplines. And I've made you a little world map here where you can see which parts of the world had futurist movements. And you can see nearly everything except Africa and Southern Asia is included, although recently I also discovered that there was a futurist group in Goa in India. So India actually should also now be colored in on this map. So Marinetti used the term futurismo mondiale to refer to a wide network of inter-avant-garde alliances and informal contacts. The new stationery of the movement summarized the key principles of what Marinetti considered to be the ideology of futurism and of the movements that derive from it. And amongst these derivative movements, he counted, and now I give you a long list: Orphism, Cubism, Dadaism, Simultaneism, Creationism, Purism, Zenithism, Surrealism, Rayism, Cubofuturism, Vorticism, Expressionism, Constructivism, Suprematism, Imaginism, and Altruism. And the same list can be found in another publication. It's called A Concise Picture of Italian Futurism and of the International Avant-Garde. And that was actually published several times in the years 1927 to 29. And it's therefore not astonishing that the futurist periodical, La Città Futurista, carried as its subtitle Synthesis of World Futurism and of All Avant-Garde Movements. And more extended versions of this interpretive model circulated in the form of essays, which had titles, and I'll just give you three from a long list, that clearly signaled the program behind it. There was the global influence of Marinetti in futurism by Emilio Settimani. There was the global influence of Marinetti in futurism by Mino Somenzi. There was F.T. Marinetti and the global influence of futurism by Angelo Rognoni. And there were even plans to edit a volume that would collect the futurist movements that had been published worldwide. This is the cover design for that anthology of worldwide futurist manifestos. And if you go to the Bionicle Library at Yale University, where Marinetti's manuscripts are kept, you will find a manuscript that shows that Marinetti had actually planned to set up a creative hub that would coordinate a network of all cutting-edge centers of the avant-garde worldwide. So seen from today's perspective, we can certainly say that Futurism had a pervasive, a far-reaching, and often profound influence in other countries. But the universal claims made by the Futurist leader that the Futurists were the protagonists of a general renewal and that all modernist and avant-garde movements had an Italian parenthood were certainly exaggerated. But such hyperbolic self-flattery formed part of a concerted effort to prove to the fascist authorities that Futurism had attained a dominant position in the contemporary cultural sphere, and of course that they should be remunerated accordingly, which never happened. It also needs to be, again, emphasized that Marinetti was a master of the art of hype. Convinced that without the right kind of publicity, artistic ideas would not receive the attention they deserved, he conducted extensive advertising campaigns and introduced American-style publicity methods into the world of belles lettres. Week after week, Marinetti sent out press releases that were often printed verbatim in the contemporary press. And many of the reviews that appeared in the newspapers, we now know, were actually penned by Marinetti himself, so that the headline the next day could be twisted in his favor. And these kind of press releases that you see here, obviously written by Marinetti, and then, you know, if you're a lazy editor of a newspaper and you haven't actually seen what the Futurists had done, they just reprint what Marinetti had said. And there's more than one occasion that I can now prove absolutely 100% that what Marinetti describes was simply not true, but it was reprinted hundreds of times in the contemporary press. So, in view of these facts, I can only encourage you, and I will do it again and again and again, to be very careful when assessing reports in the contemporary press on Futurism, and of course anything that the Futurists themselves panned about their artistic activities. All of these articles did not have the purpose of painting a true picture of events, but rather of cementing Futurism's reputations in Italy and in the world at large. And I must say that much of this continues to this day, so Marinetti was extremely successful in this method of propagating his movement. And let me summarize now in far more general terms about what I've told you, with quite specific examples. International Futurism formed part of a widespread revolt against academic art and classical models of literature. And one can therefore detect many parallels between Futurism and other movements in Europe and non-European countries. Attempts to find alternatives to traditionalist art meant that artists adopted aspects of Futurism and combined them with other, more often indigenous, sources of inspiration. And this resulted in a hybrid form of art and literature that was indebted to Futurism as well as to other movements, and also highly distinct from any of them. And this resulted in these many heterogeneous forms of Futurism in Europe and on faraway continents. And the Futurists themselves, in Italy or in Russia, never followed a monolithic set of prescriptions, but they simply incorporated ideas that were devised and devices that were received from other countries. Futurist ideas fused, as I said, with indigenous traditions in many countries, and thus gave rise to colorful and often very erratic assimilations. And this explains why, in the course of its 35 years of existence, Futurism developed so many forms and facets in dozens of countries and artistic disciplines. There can be no doubt that the artists who marched under the banners, and I'll mention just a couple of futurist-inspired movements, Zenithism, Creationism, Simultaneism, Vorticism, Ultraism, etc., etc. They were all very well informed about Italian futurism, and their concepts at one point or another benefited from the tributary influx of ideas originating in Italy. But this, I must repeat, did not turn them into futurists without knowing, as Marinetti called them in his manifesto. Although futurism made inroads into many cultures, it would be a great mistake to assume that artists in other countries were simply imitating Italian futurism. When we examine the multifaceted trends of modernism in the 1910s and 20s, I think we have to question our common linear concepts of influence. The futurist impulse coming from Italy was simultaneously repealed and preserved in the receiving cultural environments. The imported conceptions were creatively transformed into a new aesthetics that was dissimilar to Marinetti's brand of futurism, but also intimately related to it. So I would suggest it would be more appropriate to relate these developments to the Hegelian model of dialectic process, for which the philosopher employed the term Aufhebung or sublation. Here, two elements, thesis and antithesis, are fused into a synthesis which serves as a new thesis that rises above the first thesis in a process called Aufhebung. And in German, this word entails three meanings, all of which I think can be applied to the international response to futurism: to cancel out, to preserve, and to raise to a higher level. So the superficial notion of influence adopted by Marinetti in his Futurisme Mondiale needs to be replaced with a far more complex conception of intercultural reception processes. Marinetti's heuristic model of center-periphery, which is still adhered to widely, even nowadays, is rather misleading because it ignores the originality and the inventiveness of art and literature in other cultures. So futurist tendencies in Europe or in Asia or in Latin America may have been in part inspired by Italian or Russian futurism, but they did not simply derive from it, as Marinetti said in this slide that I showed you before. The complexity of this reception process, if you think it's complicated, now I have to tell you it's even more complicated, because reports on futurism were not always originating in Italy or in Russia. They were not always coming from Milan or Rome or from St. Petersburg or Moscow. The information that was circulating around the globe was mediated, or I would say filtered, by the art scenes in Paris, Berlin, Madrid, Barcelona, or Lisbon. And all of these intermediate pathways strongly shaped the attitudes towards futurism that prevailed in European and non-European countries. If we analyze the first non-Italian books written about futurism and the articles in periodicals with an international circulation, we can see that it was not Marinetti's writings that determined the cultural discourses on futurism outside Italy, but rather the viewpoints expressed by critics and journalists in other European countries. Especially French and Spanish, but also German assessments of the futurist revolt had a marked influence on the reception of futurism in other countries. So the radiation of futurist ideas from one culture to another was a process that was extraordinarily complex. In most countries, futurism was understood rather superficially at the time. It was not, as I said, Marinetti's aesthetic doctrines, but rather his method of shocking the public that received excessive exposure, usually in a sensationalist manner. Commentators picked up in a rather random fashion certain elements of futurism and completely ignored others. And thereby they were distorting the futurist aesthetic agenda. Futurist works of art were seen by many critics as something that could not even be taken seriously. Some made fun of them, whilst others saw in them simply a sign of mental illness, and that becomes particularly apparent in caricatures of the time. And if you have time to look at the 15 volumes of the International Yearbook of Futurism, so every 3 or 4 issues, I always have a section, caricatures of futurism in the contemporary press. And we have so far nearly 50 examples of these caricatures, which are really, really informative. And I just show you 2 examples. One is from Germany, caricature of futurist painting. So here is someone who obviously hasn't got a clue what futurism is, talking to the public and explains to them, this is futurist painting. Has absolutely nothing to do with futurism, but this was the method generally employed when people were talking about futurism. Or what was also, a butt of, caricatures was Rousselot's Arte de Bru, Arte de Rumori, and you see 2 examples here how futurist music was conceived at the time. Obviously, none of these people had ever heard a futurist concert, but what they depicted there had a massive influence on how futurism was perceived at the time. So these articles, these caricatures, these falsifying books demonstrate that very early on futurism actually had a second life that had nothing to do with futurism as it existed, but as it had been created by the critics, in their imagination. What Marinetti and his colleagues had originally outlined in their manifestos and works of art was simply ignored and not read at all. But even despite all of this, futurism could act as a stimulant and could exert a fertilizing function in the lives of many artists, even though they rarely adopted futurist concepts in a straightforward manner based on actual information. But I would suggest that this was exactly what Marinetti had in mind when in 1909, in his first manifesto, he welcomed the arrival, I quote, of other younger and more courageous men who look at our works and then toss them in the waste paper bin like useless manuscripts. Futurism could only exercise its fertilizing influence through this Hegelian process of sublation, to cancel out, to preserve, and then to raise to a higher level. And this was certainly the case here in Georgia, and this will be my final slide. Comparing Marinetti's typographic experiments, you can see here on the left, with those in the magazine H2SO4, we can easily see that Georgian futurism learned a few things from Italian futurism, yet it also adapted the Italian model to a local agenda. And thus Italian futurism proved a fertile ground on which many independent forms of experimentation could flourish. And more of this you will hear in the next 2 days. So thank you very much.